see the broader picture and see who these people actually were that we were dealing with. And I'll ask any other questions before. I'm going to talk a little bit about confession. I was asked by two people to say something about the two forms of confession.
A number of years ago, I looked up some things about Pilate. It seemed like some indication was there that he had become a believer at some time after the death of Christ.
Well, nobody knows for sure. Pilate was rather impressed because at one time when he first took over as governor, he came up from Caesarea. It was a night march. They came up in the nighttime. He just simply came up to make his appearance because he governed in Caesarea Maritima. And he brought in the Roman imperial standards. Now, he hadn't been informed somehow that the image of Caesar was always removed from the standards when they were taken to Jerusalem. By the previous governors always honored this, but he didn't know that. So he took all the standards in, and then of course the next day the believing Jews came out and saw them, and they saw this idol, because Caesar was presented as a god, and they wasn't presented as a man. And they demanded that they be removed. Well, the Roman soldiers couldn't do that because they'd been placed by the governor, the procurator, and they had to guard them. So this huge delegation of several hundred Jews went down from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and Pilate was going to show them who was boss. So he agreed to meet them in the hippodrome, in the stadium. And he arranged for the guards to surround the stadium, and they were going to come in and discipline these people or even kill them if necessary. Well, I mean, it turned out that there were somewhere around 700 people showed up. And they demanded that he remove the standards, and he refused. And then the guards suddenly appeared, and every one of them, they fell down on their knees and took their prayer shawls off and bared their necks. And like the high priest, we're not told who was the spokesperson at the time, said, then we'll bare our necks because it's better that we lose our heads than that we allow the defilement of the holy city with idolatry. And he was stunned, like, what to do. He said, I'm going to chop off 700 heads, and Caesar's going to be furious. So he agreed to take the standards out of the city. Well, that had a very powerful effect on Pilate, because he'd never seen people who had that kind of faith and that kind of dedication to God, and a God that you couldn't see because all of his were just a bunch of rock and wood. But they had this very powerful faith. They'd never seen that anywhere. And no one had ever seen it before. They didn't know how to cope with the Jews, because the Jews were the only people they ever encountered who were willing to die rather than violate the law of their God. Nobody else in the world would do that. And Pilate was rather shaken by that. And so it was a real quandary when we see the trial of Jesus at the interplay. And if we know that there are 3 times when Pilate had encountered this kind of reaction with pious Jews. And he was rather had to handle everything very delicately, but somehow he himself was rather moved by all this because it was very good. So maybe he did later become a Christian. Certainly some of his immediate family were well known to have been Christians, just like the soldier who accompanied Apostle Paul to Rome is buried in a Christian grave in Wales. The gravestone is still there to this day. But the Augustine band was transferred up there, and there he is.
When they did James being a priest of the temple, presumably that's where our liturgy of St. James comes from.
It's based on the temple liturgy.
It's based on the temple liturgy. At what point did they cease to use that in Jerusalem and adopt the liturgy of St. Basil and the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom? Because my understanding is we use the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom in Jerusalem. Is that not right?
Yep. The liturgy of St. James is 6.5 hours long. And the reason why St. Basil and St. John Chrysostom never wrote any liturgies at all, what they did was they standardized the liturgy throughout the empire and brought it to, in St. John Chrysostom's day, about 3 hours. But it was that long, and then there were certain aspects of the temple that figured into James's liturgy as well. But James's liturgy was celebrated the day after Sabbath by Christians early on, because that was the day of resurrection. That was the day when the Old Testament, a lot of the Christians would go to the Old Testament on the Sabbath because it was the precursor And then they would go to the Christian worship on Sunday because it was the fulfillment. Same as when we say Pascha, we're just saying Passover. In the the reason why for the Orthodox Christians Pascha always has to fall after the Jewish Passover is because the Jewish Passover is the prophecy and the Christian Passover is the fulfillment. So you have to honor both. And so the Pascha always has to fall after the Jewish Passover because it was the prototype. But James' liturgy was prototypical, or what they call a lot of prototype, from the Old Testament liturgy. So Christians worship in liturgy immediately, and the idea that they sat around the dinner table, breaking bread, sort of hippie style, was is really not. It's really just a fantasy. It really isn't true at all. So the earliest Christians mentioned the word liturgy is used in the New Testament, although it's translated as prayer meeting or prayer service in some of the translations. But the word liturgy is used, and it means formal public worship service. It's already mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles and the Epistles of the Apostles.
Wasn't Jesus alive? Was it Passover? But the Jewish Passover, was he alive?
Yeah.
Yeah, so then
He was crucified on at the Passover, just before the Passover.
Oh, I thought it was after.
On the eve of the Passover. It was the eve of the
And
Passover.
he rose after.
He rose the day after the Passover because it was the perfect Passover. And probably it was in a Jubilee year. I suspect if somebody sort of calculated all, it would have been in the Jubilee year, which is a year of redemption.